I'll just tell one more story you'll be glad to hear about buying and selling things. Um, but it's, I think, a pretty interesting story. Um, Two of the guys from the embassy were on a trip in the Soviet Union. They had gone down into Central Asia, uh, and they were now coming back from, I think, Tashkent back to Moscow, flying back. And so they got into the plane, and one of our guys found himself sitting to a lady who looked as if she might be a farmer's wife. And he noticed after a while that she had a, a bag on the floor between her feet, a fairly large bag. Um, and then he noticed later she opened the bag to look at it, and there were tomatoes inside. All right, you say tomatoes, I say tomatoes. Um, and he said to her, "Those are very good tomatoes." And she said, "Yes, they are very good." And and he said, "Where are you? Where are you taking them?" And she said, "I'm taking them to sell them in Moscow." And he said, "Well, could you not sell them at home in Tashkent?" Oh, she said, "Yes, I could, but you get much more money in Moscow if you take it up there." And so this lady was taking, would you believe, a bag of tomatoes from Central Asia to Moscow and selling them there at a good price, and then returning to her home in Tashkent. And she said to our guy that she could buy the return ticket uh, and still have a good deal of profit from the sale of the tomatoes in Moscow. Now, that's a pretty strange sort of thing when you have to go 1,500 miles to sell your potatoes. And you might say, well, where did she sell them? She didn't sell them in the stores. And that is true. She didn't sell them in the stores. She sold them in street markets that you would get in most Soviet towns. And the street markets were interesting because farmers would bring vegetables, tomatoes, for instance, especially during the summer, lettuce, celery, the whole range of greens. They bring them into these street markets to sell. Now, remember I said there were no private stores in Russia. There were no private farms either. The farmers worked on collective farms, but each of the farmers had a piece of land around the little hut he lived in, which was known as the private plot. And they could grow anything they wanted on the private plot. They couldn't grow what they wanted on the collective farm. They were told what to grow there. But on the private plot, they could grow anything they wanted, and they could sell anything they wanted. So you would find, especially in summer, that these street markets were busy places because the townsfolk had only the state stores to go to, which never had anything you really wanted. So these private plots, which were like overgrown gardens, really, a pretty big garden, they produced an enormous amount of the food that the Soviet people ate. They the the produce that was they worked on themselves in their private plot, brought in and sold in the private markets. You might wonder if we couldn't buy anything in Russian stores, how did we survive? Well, that's a pretty good story in itself. The embassy had a small store which had a few basics in it, but it was no supermarket. It was really a pretty a small store, but it was useful. But in addition to that, anyone going to the American embassy in those days had to take about a ton and a half, I would think, a ton and a half of supplies with them to last them over the 2 years. Uh, and you had to buy this yourself on your own account before you left Washington. And then the government shipped the stuff in for you, so you would get it when you arrived in Moscow. And so what you had to do, what my wife and I did before we left Washington, we sat down and tried to figure what we would need in the way of, well, stuff you use in a house, household paper, toilet paper. We had a baby, so how many jars of applesauce would he need in a year, and how many jars of sweet potatoes and celery and whatever. It was it was a pretty big job, sort of working out this list of stuff. I remember we spent a lot of time on it, but you shipped that in and then you used it for the time you were there. And you didn't sort of cover all your needs, but then there were other ways of covering some of them. One of them was that the American Air Force flew in flights with fresh food, not very often, maybe once every couple of months. But it would be a big plane. It would come in loaded with lettuce, and things like that, and then the lettuce would be delivered to our embassy store, and then there would be a wild scramble to try and get some of the stuff that the plane had brought in. And then there was another thing. Finland was quite close to Russia, still is, and parties of the ladies of the embassy would go on a trip into Helsinki, the capital of Finland, and buy usually fresh meat was what we got from Finland. So between one thing and another, it went pretty well. And I'd like to say one thing, talking about automation in the stores and how dopey that was. I wouldn't want to give the wrong impression there. I had great sympathy for the Russians. Sure, they didn't have much to eat and the clothes were shabby. But what you had to remember about them was that these were the guys who had really had an awful war, the Second World War, from 1941, in their case, to 1945. I mean, they'd been attacked by the German army in 1941, and that, in 1941, was probably, I think, the best army of the 20th century. And they had crushed it. They had worn it down in 4 years until it had to retreat all the way back into Germany, and the Russians ended up in Berlin. But they deserve respect for that. And I gave them respect for it. It was an enormous bit of heavy lifting they did for all of us. And in the process of that war, their economy had been absolutely ruined. The Germans had fought a military campaign through Russia to the gates of Moscow. They had not taken Moscow, but they'd been right up there. And, a military campaign through a country doesn't leave it in very good shape. And the Russians had also followed what they called a scorched earth policy, making it difficult for the Germans by destroying things, blowing up buildings, railroads, and stuff. And then the Germans, when they retreated back into Germany in 1945, they also pursued a scorched earth policy. They blew up anything that was left that was useful or might be useful to the Russians. So you have a Russia which has been really absolutely bowed to its knees trying to deal with this huge huge problems that the war brought with it. And they did it successfully. And I think we all owe them a debt in that way. I haven't talked yet about Soviet security. If you want, the KGB, the Soviet Secret Security Service. But they had a good deal of influence on the way we lived in Moscow because, for instance, our apartments were all bugged with microphones. The embassy was bugged. There was a security detachment outside the embassy 24/7 and 365 days a year. There was also a security detachment outside the apartment building where we lived 24/7 and 365. And in addition to that, our phones were bugged, our apartment phones were bugged, the embassy phones were bugged. So you had to be very careful about what you said and where you said it. And to give you an example of what you had to do, in the embassy itself, we built a special room which was inside a room that already existed. But we built a special room that was absolutely bug-proof. And you could go into that, and if you had anything really very confidential to talk about, you could do it there. The room was called the bubble, or sometimes the tank. But it was absolutely necessary because anywhere else in the embassy, you were subject to Soviet security attention. And I myself, just a couple of days after I got to Moscow, found myself sort of getting some attention from the KGB, which might interest you. I decided, I think I was, maybe I'd been a couple of days in Moscow and decided to go for a walk just along the avenue. And it was a brilliantly hot, marvelous summer's day. And I went off, started walking along on my own. And before long, I became aware that there was a guy or someone, I wasn't sure yet it was a guy, but someone sort of walking in step with me to my right. And I eventually turned around and looked at him. And the guy said to me, "I'm Bob." I said, "Oh, Bob, okay." And so we walked along. We kept on walking during this conversation. We didn't stop to sort of talk. We kept on going. So after a little bit, he said, "Are you a foreigner?" And I said, "Yes, I'm from the American Embassy." And he said, "Would you like to sell dollars?" Now, this was a sort of a trick question. the point was that all Russians seemed to want to get dollars, and they were willing to give you a much better rate on the ruble exchange than you could get officially. But it was illegal to do that kind of thing. It was illegal to buy rubles except at the official rate. And if you did that, you could be the subject of a complaint to the embassy and so on. So we were all warned about this, and we sort of, I think, pretty well obeyed it. So there was nothing peculiar about him asking, if I wanted to buy rubles or sell dollars. But it was the next question or the next thing he said that it was like as if he said, had just put up a sign saying, I'm from the KGB. He said, I wonder, I have a friend maybe you would like to meet. She's a girl who is a student. She's doing English at Moscow University, and she'd like to meet an American. Well, that was a sure sign it was the KGB, because that was one of their standard plays. They would try to sort of get you interested in a girl, and a relationship might develop into a relationship, and then eventually they would come to you and say something like, we've been looking at the people in your embassy, and we were wondering what Mr. So-and-so does. What part of the embassy is he in? And that would be the beginning of trying to get you to divulge information that was obviously classified. So, of course, I said, no thanks. Thanks, but no thanks. That was the end of it. We walked on a little way, and then he just said, well, goodbye. And we talked about it in the embassy afterwards, and our security people thought that it wasn't a very serious attempt to recruit me. It sounded more as if he were a young KGB officer in an early stage of training. This was a chance to tackle an American, kind of get the feel of what they were like and what they said, how they reacted to your question. So it was not what you would call a very serious thing, but it was, how shall I say, interesting. There was one other thing one serious thing that happened when I was there, which I'd like to tell you about. It wasn't nearly as dramatic as the U-2 shootdown, not nearly as dramatic, but it was much more important for American history. And it's a curious tale. I was going down for lunch in the embassy canteen one day with another guy who had been in Russian training with me, Dick Snyder, it was his name. He was in charge of the consular section of the embassy. And we were chatting the way you do, and he said to me, Frank, the funny thing happened today. A young guy came in to see me, who wants to give up his American citizenship and become a Russian. He said he was in the Marine Corps, and he's been in Russia for some time. He's living in Minsk. He's going with a Russian girl, but he's decided he wants to give up his citizenship and just become a Russian. So I asked my friend Dick Snyder, I said, well, Dick, what do you do in a case like this? Because I had no consular experience myself. And he said, well, there's a sort of a standard approach you take. You say, well, this is a terribly important step to take, and we think you should think carefully about it before you actually move any any further on it. Why don't you wait a bit and come in and see me again and we can talk it over? He said, that's the line you take, which is what Washington wants you to say in a case like that. And he said, so the guy went off. And I said, gosh, that's an odd one. So that's, you might say, chapter 1. Chapter 2 is some months later. Again, I'm going down for lunch and with Dick Snyder. And he said, Frank, you remember I told you about that young Marine, the ex-Marine who wanted to come in and give up his citizenship. He said, well, he came back today. And now he's changed his mind. He wants a passport to get back to the States. And I said, well, what do you do then, Dick? He said, oh, you give them it. You know, the Washington guidance is clear on it. You try to get citizens back to the States. He said, so we'll issue them a passport, and if necessary, we'll finance the trip back. Now, this guy was Lee Harvey Oswald. And I don't know if you know the name, but it's a name well known in American history. He was the guy who shot President Kennedy in Dallas, in Texas, in October 1963. So there was a curious little bit of American history playing out for us in the embassy in Moscow.